So, good evening, everybody. Thank you very, very much for your patience. It's a great honor to be here. My name is Judy Dempsey. I don't live in Brussels. I'm a non-resident. It doesn't mean that I don't have a roof. I live in Berlin, but I've come over for this event, and especially for my friend and boss, Jan Techau, and my friend and colleague, Ambassador Douglas Lute, American Ambassador to NATO, and Malcolm Chalmers, who's always incredibly helpful and critical and open-minded when I ask him any questions related to security and defense issues. So it's a very easy format. I told you about the food afterwards, which is always very important. American influence. Did you know this, Ambassador? Hamburgers and sausages, or whatever they call them.
Very loyal
hot dogs,
staff.
Hot dogs and mustard and all this ketchup stuff and whatever it is the Americans eat or whatever. So and also, except you're in Brussels now, so the diet is much better. I didn't mean that.
And it's got more than 2% fat.
It's a lot more than. And also, just a tiny little, as they call, housekeeping rule. And this is seriously housekeeping. I mentioned it before, but those who have just arrived, after we've had our meeting, the Carnegie team will quickly and effortlessly move the chairs somewhere. I don't know, I never know how they do it. And they'll put tables here that you can stand around. The food is behind that screen, at least we hope so. It'll materialize, and that will only take 5 or 6 minutes, and there'll be beverages as well. So, without further ado, the issue at stake, excuse the pun, the issue at stake, the politics of 2%. It's a very complicated issue, and it's quite an emotional issue and highly political, because at the Wales summit, which was quite dramatic in many ways in the background of the Ukraine crisis, they agreed on two things: the principle of 2%, that all the member states of NATO would cough up and increase the budget to 2%, and this is the nature of this discussion of the paper. And the other issue was, which was very important for the East European members of the alliance, was the Readiness Action Plan, which the Americans have invested an awful lot of time and energy and persuasion in getting this both on the ground, off the ground, and on the ground. And so we've been running this series for some time, and it's reached part of the climax with Jan's paper, and it's boldly simply called The Politics of 2%, and you can see the subsection NATO and the security vacuum in Europe. I'm going to ask Jan to speak for about 15 minutes on this, and Ambassador Lute, if you would give your thoughts or reply to it, followed by Malcolm Chalmers, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute in London, a renowned and excellent security institute in London. And then we throw it open to as much dialogue and conversation and questions as much as possible to really get to the heart of the issue. And that will be the subject of this discussion. What is the real issue? Jan, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Judy. Discussing 2% is a tricky and wonderful little issue in this town, but also across Europe, because as Judy said, it's partially an emotional one. But in my opinion, it's something much bigger than this emotional thing, and it's much bigger than the technical kind of air it has. 2% sounds like a budgetary thing, sounds like something that is for numbers geeks, and it is to a certain extent, but it is about much more, and I'm trying to make that case in the paper, and it's one of the points of the paper that gets most frequently attacked, actually, and that is that discussing 2% really means discussing the security vacuum in Europe. It means discussing the question that is unanswered after the end of the Cold War: who takes care of European security? We all know how that was organized after World War II. When the Cold War broke out and then very quickly escalated. The NATO was created. America became the most important military power in Europe. Europeans were organized in an alliance. America issued a security guarantee, and that was the game. And all of the Cold War discussion was mostly about this. But since the early 1990s, we've had basically a silent strategic revolution in Europe, and that is the systematic reduction of the American footprint in Europe. And not only in terms of its physical presence, of course, a lot less troops, a lot less hardware here, but also in terms of the political capital that American governments can spend on Europe when they make decisions concerning Europe. And when they try to make the case for a continued engagement in Europe. all administrations continuously have found it more difficult to make the case for Europe. And this is the silent revolution that I'm talking about, when you actually outsource most of your security, extended security, to your big ally outside of Europe, and if that ally then has less political capital to spend on you, then you have a problem. This is partly out of choice on behalf of the United States, but for the most part it's a matter of necessity. The Americans really have to go elsewhere because the international strategic soup kitchen, if you will, of the world, the region of the world that will most likely decide about global stability is not going to be Europe in the future. It's going to be Asia Pacific in the widest sense. And so America, as the backbone of the global liberal order, if you believe in that, needs to refocus and needs to allocate its resources, which are also, in relative terms, weaker and smaller. And this poses a problem because the US presence is systemic for European security. It is the one element that you can't remove if you want this continent to be stable for two reasons. It has an external and an internal dimension. The external dimension is extended deterrence, how the Americans are protecting Europe from not only from territorial attack, but also from political blackmail. That's mostly done through a presence here, but also through, of course, nuclear deterrence. But it also has an internal dimension, which is often not talked about in Europe, and that is the fact that by being the dominant military power in Europe, the Americans have removed the questions of which European power does dominate Europe. That question does not exist any longer. You know, the old power rivalries in Europe, in terms of the forces that shaped European history for 2,000 years, that was a removed issue. That was not present any longer. And once you remove that energy and that trust infusion that the Americans brought just by being here, you know, old rivalries, you know, could very well, you know, pop up again. And you see this already a little bit, you know, with the uneasiness that many Europeans have about the very strong German position at the moment in Europe. And so the US presence here is one about external security and one about internal trust. And so you have the US with all of that systemic relevance having to move elsewhere. I'm simplifying, of course, grossly. And you have the Europeans, on the other hand, who are not stepping up, who are not, you know, stepping in and filling the gap. They don't do this. I mean, systematically, they have also reduced their military capabilities since the early 90s. And that is a trend that I think, despite some recent, you know, changes, that is a trend that is basically unbroken and will most likely continue in the future. And between those two trends, Americans going elsewhere, Europeans not stepping up, you have, you know, a security vacuum, or at least potentially a security vacuum. And that is the problem that I think is really the one kind of issue, the big issue that lurks behind the 2% question. And all of that, of course, happens not in a equally benign kind of environment, you know, the benign environment that we had, you know, before the Balkan Wars in Europe, but that happens in a security situation where actually the neighborhood and the wider neighborhood of Europe is getting less stable, more complicated, and more dangerous. NATO, as a result, you know, as I said, is less capable in both territorial defense and also, and that is also crucial here, this is not only about territorial defense. This is also about the lack of capability in interventionist capabilities, you know, in expeditionary capabilities. And that is actually a function, or that leads to a loss of authority, you know, mostly for America, but also for the Europeans as such, in its wider neighborhood in terms of the power that, you know, imposes order. And we see this in Ukraine. In my opinion, Ukraine is one symptom of that security vacuum. There's a leader in Moscow who senses that there is a door open in Europe, that order cannot be easily imposed any longer by the West, that the authority of the United States and of the Europeans as a derivative of that is weakened, and that you can actually get away with stuff. You can get away with challenging the European security architecture. Another example, you know, as to how this plays out, this vacuum, could potentially be Turkey. There's an ally there, a NATO ally, with a political leadership that is very, very, very difficult to discipline in a way that it never really was. So also there, I think you see the symptoms of this lack of authority that comes from having fewer capabilities all around. If you can't issue security guarantees any longer that sound credible, your political influence will become weakened. So 2% is only one symptom of this wider problem. The discussion in Europe about 2% is actually, when you look at all of the other symptoms and count them all together, it's actually quite frantic. This 2%, the security vacuum issue is discussed not only as 2%, but also as, should Germany be more of a hard security provider? There's a lot of noise about this, a lot of discussions about this. Germans have stepped out of their comfort zone, but most people would say not enough. And given its size and its economic power, it's not doing enough. So that's another symptom. The discussion about should the European Union be more of a military provider of hard security. Recent discussions about the European army. That's another symptom for the security vacuum. The question over UK nuclear arms, and maybe Malcolm will tell us a little bit about it later on, is another example. TTIP, in my opinion, is part of that power vacuum as well. The geopolitical dimension of TTIP, which is often invoked in Europe these days, is about how can we bind the two transatlantic partners together in a kind of relationship of political fate, so that they can't be divided and so that they will be mutually integrated in a way that makes them mutually dependent and therefore kind of married forever. For me, also part of the debate about the security vacuum. And then, of course, the longer kind of standing debate about the new security architecture for Europe that also includes Russia, that also includes every country that is not part of NATO for the moment, that including NATO expansion, obviously. These questions are all part of that issue of how do we address that security vacuum that's emerging. This security vacuum is primarily Europe's problem, less so America's problem. It is also an American problem, but primarily a European one, and it is primarily the Europeans' fault. We've talked a lot about the reduction of the American footprint, but it's the Europeans that should take care of European security, and they're not. So it affects both the Europeans and the United States, and it creates a dilemma for both, only that the dilemma is different for both. For the US, the dilemma is this. People like Ambassador Lute have to do it every single day. They need, on the one hand, send a message to the European allies, our security guarantee is watertight. Don't worry, we're there, we'll protect you. That is not only important for Europeans, but that's also important for America and America's position in the world. But at the same time, he needs to tell the same Europeans that they need to do more because America will do less for them. And that is a dilemma. That is, if you think it radically, those are mutually exclusive messages. Now, of course, you can tie them somehow together, but it is a dilemma in communicating this, because the Europeans, of course, could read the reassurance as also kind of a free riding ticket. Okay, the Americans are there, they'll take care of it, we don't have to do anything. While saying that the Europeans have to do more could create insecurity among them, which it actually has. So it is a dilemma that the Americans are facing. The European dilemma is different. The European dilemma is that either they do more, which means spending more on defense, which is very, very painful to do, or they actually spend what they have in a smarter way, but that means that they have to integrate it and pool it and share it, and that means a loss of sovereignty. So either they pay in terms of money, or they pay in terms of sovereignty. That's the dilemma that they are in. And it's equally difficult for them. So far, the decision has almost always been sovereignty is more important. But that might be, impossible to maintain over the long run. So we have two dilemmas here for the United States in terms of its security guarantee, for the Europeans in terms of its question of resources versus sovereignty. Very quickly, two questions. Is the 2% goal realistic, and is it useful? And I'm covering this extensively in the paper, and so you can read all of this stuff, including many sources. Is the 2% goal realistic? Will the countries heed the pledge that they signed in Wales? And for the most part, no, it's not very realistic. We all know this. And this is the consensus to whomever you basically talk. 5 countries are earmarked to meet the goal in this year, the US, UK, Poland, Estonia, and Greece. But 2 of them are basically already near 2%. That's the Americans and the UK. Poland and Estonia matter, but not an awful lot, because they don't have very big militaries. So if they increase, that doesn't buy NATO an awful lot more. The Estonian defense minister famously said at a conference a couple of years ago that his 2% is about 32 minutes of US defense spending. So even if you spend 10, that wouldn't buy NATO an awful lot. And Greece is a case that many of you who are familiar with the debate is a bit of an oddity anyways. So, that's not really the kind of powerhouses out there that are going to 2%. And many of the others that actually matter, like the Germans, the Italians, or the Spaniards, if you look at, the other remaining powers outside Britain and France and Europe, the ones that actually do matter, who have sizable enough militaries that if they do actually expand their spending, that they would matter. They don't have any inclination to really up their spending. A little bit, cosmetically, yes, the Germans indeed, but the others not so much, and that's about that. And everybody else is just too small to really matter, to put it a bit, in a simplified way. The economic situation stays very problematic in Europe. It's a very tough case to make for every prime minister or finance minister to spend more on defense. And then, perhaps more importantly, what drives defense spending, and I think, studies have been done and the correlation is quite clear. What drives defense spending is a threat assessment, is a feeling of being threatened. Europeans do not fundamentally feel threatened. I'm not talking about every country feeling the same way. Of course, some countries do feel threatened, but overall, Europeans do not fundamentally feel threatened, despite Ukraine and despite the Islamic State and some other, threats in their neighborhood. They still feel that this is fundamentally a safe thing, and that not much, is important. So all of these arguments, for me, make it clear that it's not very realistic that we will ever get to 2% across the board. And a couple of countries have actually quite, made it quite clear that they don't even intend to go to 2%, despite having signed the pledge. So not very realistic. Is it useful? That's a very different kind of question. If you use the 2% metric as a metric that measures actual military output, the answer is no. It's not particularly useful. It's way too simplistic for that. It doesn't really measure any of the things that we want to know. The quality of the forces, the deployability of forces, the sustainability of forces, what you actually get out of the money that you spend. So that is, it's an input metric and not an output metric. That's a fundamental flaw in the 2% metric, conceptually. And it creates a credibility risk for NATO, which further undermines its usefulness, because when you don't meet 2%, but you announce it with a lot of fanfare, then you have a public diplomacy problem. But politically, it's very different. Politically, this is enormously useful. It's an enormously useful tool to actually drive the debate. The naming and shaming and the 2% mechanism sometimes works. Countries like Great Britain go to great lengths to actually stay within 2%. Because falling underneath 2% for them actually would be quite a shameful little thing. I'm done in about 20 seconds. So the naming and shaming works, which tells me that politically it's actually quite a useful little tool. It's part of the annual defense planning process of NATO, which means that every country every year needs to explain where it stands and why it doesn't do more. And over time that might have an effect. So politically that's really important. Most importantly, in terms of its political value, and this is underestimated in Europe, it is tremendously important on the American side. For the Americans in Washington, when you listen to the debate, 2% has become the gold standard against which European engagement is measured. The ones that are near 2% or have ambitions to go to 2% are the ones that are interested. The ones that do less than this seem to be free riders and don't really get the story. In the US, 2% has become a really important measure of whether the Europeans are in NATO, seriously. And this is why those who are interested, those Americans who are interested in European security, like Ambassador Lute, but also others, are frantically pushing the Europeans to actually do more, because when they go back to Washington and try to make the case for Europe, the more 2%ers they have on their side, the better for them in the internal debates in the White House and elsewhere. And this is, I think, something the Europeans often don't get, how important 2% as a symbol has become on the American side. And they need to really get this, because that, will change the dynamic, I think, politically. I think I will basically leave it as this. My final conclusion is that, 2% is flawed in many ways as a technical measure, as a concept, but it is politically enormously useful. But it is only one symptom for a wider debate that's playing out in Europe, and for a wider strategic dilemma that plays out in Europe, which 2% alone will not be able to resolve. But it is perhaps the best reminder that something's cooking on this continent, and the Europeans will have to do more in the end, and 2% is the thorn in their flesh, essentially. And this is why, despite all of the shortcomings of 2%, it remains an important thing to play with.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan, for that great discussion, this overview of your paper, but actually bringing quite controversial issues to the fore. Ambassador Lute, I'm very tempted to ask you if there really is a security vacuum in Europe, which is really what Jan's argument is. How do you see this, just not the 2% issue, but this whole back and forth between Europe and the United States?
Well, the report is labeled the politics of 2%. So the politics really for NATO culminated at the Wales Summit, which is just almost precisely a year ago. So let me just unpack a little bit of the context of the decision taken by the 28 leaders and heads of state, to include President Obama on our part. Why did they sign up for this pledge? What was it about Wales was this just persuasive diplomacy on behalf of the U.S. mission to NATO? No. Some of my staff, I think that, but that's not actually the case. There were a series of factors that came together, that intersected at Wales, and I'll tick them off for you here, that I think changed the conversation on 2% and really reflect back on Jan's point about this being a political tool or a political factor. So first of all, at Wales, the conversation was very much, and somewhat unexpectedly, somewhat surprisingly, very much shifted to what the leaders began to call the arc of instability. And what they're referring to, of course, is Putin in the east with Ukraine, to the southeast, ISIL. Just 30 days or so before the Wales Summit, ISIL seized the second largest city in Iraq, Mosul. And of course, all of this was taking place on the Syrian and Iraqi border with Turkey, a NATO ally, a 1,500-kilometer border. So that was happening at Wales. And then to the south, across the Med, you saw the what I consider a failed state in Libya, and the beginning of a migrant flow out of Libya, using Libya as sort of the end of the funnel. But migrants really coming from the Sahel, the Middle East, and even South Asia. So all this came together and was on the leaders' plate when they met in Wales. If that weren't enough, they were reminded that NATO had unfinished business. We're still in Afghanistan. We're still in Kosovo. Leaders were reminded that we had responsibilities and relationships with 40-some partners around the world that range from Morocco to Japan and many nations in between. They were reminded that NATO had committed to new capabilities that were about to come online, and they were going to be expensive. Capabilities like the Alliance Ground Surveillance System, essentially the first high-altitude, long-endurance drone that NATO will own and operate in the coming years, and also the NATO Ballistic Missile Defense System, which is also expensive. So new capabilities. So when you add this up, arc of instability, unfinished business, partners, new capabilities, it became pretty clear that this wasn't going to be cheap. Meanwhile, these same 28 leaders had a financial portfolio that they brought with them to Wales. So it wasn't just a security situation. They, of course, are the keepers of the checkbooks, ultimately, for their governments. And by 2014, all 28 allies were beginning to move out of the trough of the 2008 recession. Now, the recovery from 2008 is still, to this day, uneven. But this year, for I think the first year since the recession, all 28 allies are showing some growth. Now, some of the growth is below 1%, some of it's right on the margin. But for the first time, there's pretty even evidence that we've turned the tide. Now, again, it's very uneven, so we can get into the specifics there. But the economic system or situation seemed to be turning. And then finally, there was recognition of this persistent imbalance that Jan's report refers to. And this, of course, has a comparison between two roughly equal GDPs, the GDP of the United States and the summed GDP of the other 27, which are roughly equal. And yet defense spending against these two denominators, roughly equal denominators, has the United States spending 70% of the total and the other spending only 30%. So there was this sort of gap between commitment to the alliance, which is equally shared, and obligations and resources committed by way of funding, which from the United States perspective is out of balance. It's a 70-30 out of balance. So what did the leaders actually do? So they signed up, here's what they signed up for. And, you know, there were no proxies, they were all there. The lights were on. It was read very clearly, and they signed up for the following: that all 27 agreed that they would reverse the decline in national defense budgets and move towards 2% of GDP for defense spending in the course of a decade. So nobody appreciated this. Nobody thought this was going to happen overnight, right? And they further said that inside that 2% defense spending figure, they would commit 20% towards capital investment. So equipment investment, not manpower, not operations and maintenance, but towards new equipment. So 2% and 20%. That's essentially the pledge. Now, there are some common misperceptions about the pledge. In fact, the report highlights, and Jan's comments actually highlight some of these misperceptions. First of all, that NATO is fixated artificially, unrealistically, on a too narrow bumper sticker number, 2%. What is 2%? Jan says neither realistic nor, in some ways, useful. And that actually a more sophisticated metric would be to focus on outputs. So not inputs, not outputs. Not on quantities of inputs, but on qualities of outputs. And if NATO were a sophisticated organization, it would in fact do that. Well, I'm here to report tonight that in fact we do, okay? So you can't fit all of this on a bumper sticker, which maybe today reads 2%, but the reality is that NATO every year across all 28 allies assesses these two input measures, so 2% and 20%, alongside 9 output measures. These are all qualitative measures of output. They involve air, land, and sea forces, and they involve the ability of that ally to deploy those forces and the ability of that ally to sustain those forces. So we do a very deliberate measurement every year of outputs. Some say the 2 input measures are unrealistic. Well, they're missing the story. There are 11 metrics, not 2. And 9 of the 11 are focused on outputs. Now, these remain difficult because of the political narrative. The output measures remain classified. And you can imagine why. I mean, they're not perfect. These metrics are not green across the board with all 28 allies meeting all 9 output measures. And it's not smart for a military alliance to demonstrate publicly and to have this conversation publicly about shortfalls and capabilities and so forth. In fact, I'll tell you, but I will give you some insight to the classified reports, okay? First of all, no single ally among the 28 meets all 9 output measures. So the United States of America is not green across the board on output measures. We all have work to do. Very significantly, we've done some research, and it turns out there's a correlated effect empirically between input measures and output measures. So what might seem sort of intuitive, that you've got to pay more to get more, actually proves out empirically. And so it takes inputs to get outputs. So for those who would say, well, you measure this is unrealistic, it's wrong, it's sophomoric, actually there's a correlated effect between inputs and outputs. And then finally, the pledge itself refers in passing to the output measures, and the leaders committed to those as well. Now, there's also some fine print or some overlooked portions of the pledge, elements of the pledge that I want to highlight to you. First of all, it allows us how the 28 economies are not going to grow uniformly. So the pledge actually includes the words, as economies grow, you move towards 2% and move towards it. The second is, this is going to be a long-term effort. The pledge is explicit in the course of a decade, right? So here we are 1 year after Wales. I'm going to give you the data here in a second, and it's not uniformly positive. But again, this is a long-term effort. You don't turn around public spending on the order of magnitude that we're talking about here in order to close the 70-30 gap in 1 or 2 budget cycles. It takes a prolonged effort over a decade. The other thing that's somewhat overlooked is that this is the first time in NATO's history that the 2% pledge, which has been around for a while, I mean, this wasn't invented at Wales, but that it's the first time in NATO history that it was taken by leaders. When we went back and looked at this as we were working on the pledge in the run-up to Wales, we actually said, well, where did this come from? And who has made this pledge before? And is this really a meaningful thing to take to President Obama in his 20s? Or is this just rhetoric? And it turns out the NATO record is that only defense ministers in the past had ever committed to 2%. Well, imagine how easy that was politically, right? You've got 28 defense ministers. They're all agreeing that their budgets should be increased. That's not that ambitious, actually. They then went back to 28 capitals, and they were undoubtedly met at the airport by the 28 finance ministers, okay, and subsequently by the 28 leaders of government and heads of state. Okay, so I don't think it was very ambitious of NATO over the years to get defense ministers to agree that their own budgets should increase. So Wales is different in that regard. This was leaders, and this is leaders who had the whole fiscal portfolio of their governments at hand. And then the last thing I think I'd like to just update you on is where are we now? So we're 1 year into a 10-year process. Well, maybe we should do this every year for 10 years this session so that we can update one another, right? But here's where we're at. First of all, we're starting from a low baseline. I mean, I don't refute Jan's report. Today, 5% or 5 allies make the 2% cut. 7 make the 20% capital investment. So it's 5 and 7 today out of 28, which is not very encouraging. However, in the course of the last year, since the Wales pledge, here's the data. 21 of the 28 have halted or reversed the decline in defense spending towards the 2% goal. So 21 have halted or reversed the decline, which is all that's required year by year. We won't be able to judge the full impact of the pledge until year 10 at the end of the decade. And beyond those 21, 24 have halted or reversed the decline in the 20% factor, the capital investment factor. So look, largely we agree with the Carnegie report. We got it right. It's 2% is largely a political tool. It highlights, very importantly though, the political obligations of burden sharing and collective defense. That's not an obligation that's 70% the American obligation. That's an obligation that's shared across all 28 allies. It is useful on both sides of the Atlantic. And in his political outline, or his outline of the political utility, I largely agree with that. It's helpful for me to go back to Washington and have 2% and the pledge written out. I show it to every congressional delegation that comes through Washington. That's good for me. That's good news. And then finally, I think it's useful for Europeans, and this goes to the question of security vacuum, to assess whether their commitments, their defense, their collective, I was about to say, that whether they've sufficiently invested in their own collective defense. So, and let me just take you one short excursion to the Washington Treaty. Article 3 in the Washington Treaty, not Article 5, Article 3 in the Washington Treaty obliges every member nation to take sufficient steps domestically, internally, individually, towards self-defense. And it obligates in Article 5 that an attack on one is attack on all. The Washington Treaty, though, is founded first on national obligations. Article 3 precedes Article 5 in the layout of the treaty. So all 28 of us have national responsibilities. And I think, given what's going on around Europe today, given the disparity, 70-30, that it's time, and I think this is what the pledge does for European leaders. It's time for European leaders to look at the ledger sheet and determine whether or not they're sufficiently committed to their own defense.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We can go back to the security vacuum, which you barely skirted over, but we can go back. I just want to raise one thing that I've always wanted to ask you about this 70-30 disparity. I mean, when you look at it, perhaps it's not that surprising because the interests of the United States are so different.
I admit this.
So just putting that into the context of NATO gets quite distorted.
I agree with you, Judy. Look, this is, we should understand that NATO does not have global security commitments. The United States does.
Exactly.
Right? So the United States is not, when you look inside the United States defense budget, the 70%, there's not a line item in there that says this chunk is devoted
Yes.
to NATO.
Yes, but
Okay?
what it
So
does
we
show,
approach this globally.
yes, that before we get into but what, we can bring this up later. What it does show, though, even the 30% that the Europeans are doing, they're not defined in terms of geostrategic interests. Malcolm, there's an awful lot of meat in these two presentations, but we're very interested in David Cameron's pledges or non-pledges and the defence review coming up, the strategic review. There's been so much discussion about this. How do you see the perception from London?
Well, first of all, can I just say that I recommend Jan's paper, which has provoked a lot of thoughts. It's a very meaty paper, and I'd recommend it to all of you, although there are some points in which we might have a discussion. But Judy, let me start
Yes,
by saying
please.
a few things about the position in the UK, because I think it's fair to say that the UK as a host country for the last NATO summit was in part responsible for putting this issue on the agenda.
The U.S. and the UK linked arms on this inside the
I
alliance.
think that's right. And I think, as many of you are also aware, the fact that after that summit, David Cameron then became rather unclear as to how long the UK would stay at 2%. Wasn't helpful for the UK diplomatically, and a lot of UK government officials, military and civilian, had a lot of very uncomfortable meetings with American diplomats and American leaders in Washington. I've heard reports of many of those meetings in the period between the Newport summit and July of this year. But in July of this year, the UK Treasury committed to real terms increases in our defence budget of 0.5% per annum through to the end of the decade, and also committed to meeting the 2% NATO commitment through to the end of the decade. The first is very important in terms of stopping the real terms decline in defence spending that's been in place in our country since 2010. The latter is a matter of great diplomatic relief in our relationship with our allies. And the reason why 0.5% real growth keeps you at 2% in an economy that's growing at 2.5% per annum is because we've discovered other areas which we didn't previously include in our NATO reporting, which we are eligible to include. So we were too conservative in our reporting to NATO in the past. And by the end of the decade, there will be about £5.5 billion of spending, which we will report to NATO, on items which we previously did not report to NATO. But certainly my understanding is that NATO's accepted that those additional things, pensions, UN peacekeeping contributions, Ministry of Defence income, elements of our intelligence services, we should have been including all along. So everybody's happy that the UK is now back on board with 2% in a way which it appeared it wasn't. And our Minister of Defence is happy because given the budgetary situation in our country, the expectation until July was that there would have been further real terms cuts in our defence budget in this year's spending review, and there are not. There's an interesting issue in our country, which I'm not sure if it applies to any other, about the mutually reinforcing character of our commitment to the 0.7% official development assistance target from the UN and the NATO 2% target. Because one of the strongest arguments within our country for meeting the 2% was, well, we're meeting the 0.7%, we're committed to aid, we should do the same in defence. And it's also the case that there were many who were saying, well, if we're going to fall below the 2%, then why do we keep the 0.7%? And actually one of the interesting phenomena since July has been the political pressure on the 0.7% has been substantially reduced because we're going to meet the 2%. So I'm not sure that applies to any other country, but now I think a large part of the narrative of the government, already you'll see it more in our Strategic Defence and Security Review by the end of the year, is that we're a 2.7% power. We do both aid and defence. We are punching above our weight on both of those, and actually the UK will be the biggest European spender in absolute terms on both aid and defence. Already is and will continue to be in that position. But I think it's also important, this maybe comes back to the issue of metrics, that the relative scale of commitment to collective operations or collective preparations, the sort of the output the ambassador was talking about, is also important. So things like who's contributing the most to anti-ISIL operations in Iraq and Syria. The UK is the largest European contributor to the air campaign, provides a very significant proportion indeed of ISTAR assets in Iraq and Syria. And also on the aid side is the largest contributor of humanitarian assistance around Syria and in Syria after the United States. Always very important. So that's in a sense where we're coming from for the UK. Let me make 4 other points briefly. The first, I think all the comments in different ways are sort of saying about Jan's paper that there's a lot of good things you're saying, but I think you overstate the extent to which the current situation is unstable or unique. So the first point I would make in that regard is if you look at the relative levels of defense spending of the major European countries, then the relationship between those countries is pretty well as it was right back in the 1950s. It alters a little bit from one decade to another, but basically the Brits and the French are at the top of the league table, and the Italians, the Spanish at the bottom, and so on. It's a sort of, now, the East Europeans are a separate case because they've only joined the West European community after the end of the Cold War. But for the major West European powers, those relationships are pretty stable. And the reason for that is not because some of us are more communitarian and more generous in terms of our contributions to the common good than others, although sometimes people in Westminster might say the UK or British are particularly generous people. It is because of our different national defense policies. Sometimes all these numerical comparisons might mislead you to thinking that these are all subscriptions, that the UK taxpayer spends 38 billion a year on defense because we love contributing to the common effort. And of course that's part of the explanation, but much more of it, I think, is because of our perception of our own national interests, and I think that's true of all NATO countries, including the United States. And why do the UK and France spend more than others? Partly because they have a nuclear deterrent, which is driven in large measure by national security considerations, which none of the other NATO European countries have. And partly because we want to maintain some degree of independent expeditionary capability. Modest in some regards, but both the UK and France have launched successful expeditionary missions outside Europe and continue to have that capability, continue to be major players in the Middle East with bases. We have bases in the Gulf and in Cyprus, and indeed, of course, we have the Falklands Commitment. So that's none of that's going to change. No other European country is going to become a nuclear power. I don't think Germany is going to suddenly become a major expeditionary power. It's not in the strategic culture. It's not in the way those countries define their objectives. And therefore, I think these relative numbers, I don't think are going to change very much. And actually, we've all got pretty comfortable with it. I mean, everybody moans. There's always a backwards and forwards, and Brits always say, well, why don't these continentals do more, and so on. But and the Americans complain about the Europeans collectively. But I'm not sure whether anything's changed so dramatically. I think the commitment to real terms increases, and the ambassador's statement that most NATO countries are now doing that is very important, because in a sense that's keeping the relativities the same, but there's a rising tide for all of us because of the increased concerns about Russia and the South. And I think that's very helpful. And that commitment at Wales is very helpful. I don't think we're going to have a large number of countries which are sub 1.5% moving towards 2% anytime soon, because national priorities are not going to change radically. So that's the first point. The second point, again, is maybe a conservative, boringly conservative point to make, is that discussion about the United States effectively withdrawing its security guarantee against major power aggression in Europe, which Jan suggests is somehow a possibility. I mean, we've been round the circle ever since NATO was founded. You saw the Korean War; they were more interested in Korea than Europe. Then the Vietnam War, immediately before 9/11, Condi Rice was talking about focusing in the Asia-Pacific, Hillary Clinton, and basically the United States is a global power. It has really strong security commitments to Europe, to NATO Europe, to East Asia, and maybe in a more confused extent in the Middle East, but also important there. And I'm a skeptic. I mean, that doesn't mean that our security interests always coincide. In the Balkans in the 90s, we saw the confusion there. But and we'll continue to get examples where the Americans on less than vital conflicts have a very different view. And that's one of the reasons I think it's important of autonomous European capability. I just don't see a trend. I'm skeptical about this long-term trend to the Americans disengaging in Europe. And I think the American response to the revival of Russian concerns illustrates that. Third point is that I actually do believe that total defense budgets are the best single indicator of defense capability. They are important. Spending does matter, and it does matter in lots of different ways, even if it's misdirected in different ways, and it's more relevant than the percentage of GDP. But it's also relevant in comparison between NATO and other countries. The Russian defense budget has been growing rather rapidly for the last decade. And it's also relevant that China is now the #2 defense spender in the world, way above Russia, and continues to grow rapidly. But it's also relevant that the total NATO defense budget this year is $650 billion. And the Russian defense budget was, at pre-crisis exchange rates, $90 billion, and today more like $50 billion. And of course, there are all sorts of ways in which maybe Russia gets better value for money from its defense budget than NATO does, because it's one country rather than several, and so on and so forth. I know those arguments, but nevertheless, that's a pretty big disparity. And the problems, I would argue, in relation to deterrence of Russia are not primarily about aggregate NATO defense spending or capability. They're about responding to asymmetric Russian threats, subconventional, I'm not sure I like the term hybrid warfare, but subconventional or nuclear threats, or ways in which Russia tries to get under the skin of NATO cohesion by undermining the political unity of the alliance, and indeed undermining the political unity of individual member states, which themselves are divided internally. And spending more money on defense may be part of that solution, but what's more important is what they spend it on. And a lot of the spending actually maybe in non-defense elements of security, strengthening the police in places like the Baltic republics and so on. So that asymmetric dimension is really important in Russia. And finally, I think, Jan's paper and Deeze's presentation talked a little bit about some of the concerns in relation to renationalization of defense in Europe, which I think is a very important factor. And one of the key benefits of NATO historically has been precisely what he said, that it's alleviated the security dilemmas rather equally sized European countries had in the past, ever since German reunification in the 1870s, and that's a very important part of Europe. And one of the things I do worry about European security, and I think it's actually more of a pink elephant than a black swan, I mean, it is a big elephant in the room which we can all see, is that we are in a period of significantly increased potential for political instability in Europe. A lot of things we've taken for granted in terms of European integration, or the potential for European disintegration, including in relation to my country, are more evident than they have been for some time. And one of the consequences of global recession has been that we have parties on the left and the right getting stronger in a number of our member states, who are outside the post-war liberal consensus. And it's not yet at crisis point, but one can imagine ways in which it might be, and in which would create circumstances in which external actors, including Russia, might exploit that. And of course, the crisis we've all been talking about over the last couple of months in relation to refugees and migrants from Africa and from the Middle East is a structural problem, arguably a bigger threat bigger challenge for European security and European societies than terrorism, which is not going to go away anytime soon, but which precisely is linked to some of the worrying political trends in many of our countries, including my own country, that we're facing. So the security dynamic a lot of it has to be about precisely whether there are some threats to that denationalization, which we successfully achieved in the 1950s after the catastrophe of World War II, but which I don't think we can ever take for granted.
Malcolm, thank you very, very much for that contribution. I just want to bring up this. I mean, having read Jan's report, I don't think he was saying that America was going to pull away the security guarantee. What he was, in my interpretation, that Europe itself was creating a security vacuum for their own security. I mean, I don't think the US would dare give up the security guarantee. I don't think that's would never. I mean,
let me just clarify this.
Yes.
And this is not altruism. This is
It is
just national interest.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
we've made this commitment since
Absolutely.
1949
Yes.
for in the interest of Europe and a peaceful, stable Europe. But that is fundamentally in American interest. So the reason we should remain confident that there's not going to be an ultimate vacuum is that it's in America's interest that there not be so.
That's what I'm saying in the report.
Right.
But the thread going through the three arguments, although you may see it a little bit differently, Ambassador, than most of them, the thread still is the fact that the Europeans as Europeans do not still have a common threat perception, which actually affects how they see the budgets, affects how they work with themselves, let alone how they deal with the United States. And I think this is a hugely debilitating aspect. And Jan touched on, I think we still are in the comfort zone. And what will push the Europeans out of this comfort zone as if we should have been out of it a long time ago, ever since Georgia, in some ways, Russia's invasion of Georgia. I don't know what will push Europe to actually understand why they have to really boost the defense and work much more collectively together. This is what bothers me about this trend in Jan's paper. Jan, do you want to pick up on any of the comments, or shall we, will I invite...
I will say one or two things very briefly, and then, yeah. First of all, what Malcolm just said in the very end is, I think, very important, and it relativates the entire party here tonight a little bit. The real threat, of course, to European security comes from within Europe, and that has always been the case. I mean, that's very clear, and this is why the political fallout, from many of the internal crises is so worrisome. We are a foreign policy think tank, so we don't primarily focus on the internal kind of integration issues that Europe has, but it's deeply worrying because, of course, it has a direct impact on the ability of the Europeans to act as a foreign policy entity, both individually as nations and also, of course, together as Europeans, both inside NATO and the EU. There are a couple of things that I could comment on that were said. It is true. I have to find this now, and I don't want to kind of drag this out. About some of the points that were made. Yes, it was said that the spending patterns are roughly the same today as they were in the 1950s, and that basically that seems to indicate that we're in pretty good shape. That might be true in terms of the relative spending,
relative spending, yeah.
Yes, when you compare them with each other. But it's all at a considerably lower level than it was. Of course, we don't have the mortal threat of the Soviet Union any longer, and that is a huge factor in all of this, and that dictates threat perceptions. But my feeling is that we're moving into territory that's a lot more dangerous, and with that comfort zone in place, the fact that we're all spending at the relatively same patterns doesn't comfort me a great deal, I have to say.
And if I may on that, I mean, this is what was different at Wales. It was the combination of Crimea, Donbass, Mosul, and migrants that maybe forced the leaders out of their comfort zone. And that dynamic was different.
But you see, Ambassador, if you go on this argument, you have to factor in Malcolm's point. The threat to security, yes, it's outside, but it's coming from within, which complicates the issue, which the Americans must be very worried about.
Oh, fair enough, but that's not fundamentally.
I know.
That's not a NATO issue from inside, as much as it is, sort of an EU political national issue.
Oh, I think it should go on. I think it is a NATO issue. But
if you're taking this argument as far as questioning democratic principles and so forth. Yes, I mean, those all have, that's all part of the underpinning of the alliance. But I don't know that we're going that far, right? That we're actually, was that your point?
No, I mean, it doesn't affect NATO as an institution unless countries have a coup or
Nobody's
leave.
ever left NATO, okay? So we don't have to sort of.
We have been very accommodating to non-liberal, governments inside NATO during the Cold War. It would probably be less so today, but under the threat of the Cold War, it was perfectly fine to accommodate non-democratic governments inside NATO, and we will probably be able to do the same thing again if we have to.
I mean, I wasn't really addressing it as a NATO point, more as a national security or a collective security point. And I think for my country, for example, the security implications of the United Kingdom breaking up, as could have happened last year, or the UK voting to leave the European Union, on one level, what's the implication for defence? But there will be implications for defence of either of those things happening. We can think of examples of that sort in most countries, I think.
Okay, I think I should open this up to the floor. I think the idea, if we could take 3 or 4 questions at a time, first of all, identify yourselves, and secondly, 1 question per person, and please keep them very focused. Can I just see the hands first? You, Fabrice, and 3, and the 4. There's a nice group of 4 there, and I'll come, sorry, I missed you. We'll come round. So, you're first, please. Yes, it's coming.
Thank you. I've been told, sitting here, that was the seat of the one who wants to ask the first question. So I just try to fulfill my commitment. My name is Frederick Moreau. I'm a former civil servant of the French Senate, and I'm now a lawyer at the Bar of Paris and the Bar of Brussels. It happens that I've worked for one of my clients this year on the PESCO. PESCO is a permanent structured cooperation. And it took me a long time, and I found out that it's very similar to the 2% metrics, the 2% politics in its spirits. What we are talking about is to increase the percentage of spending of the people. I will not question the realistic goal of the 2% quality, although I want to raise the fact that it will take $87 billion for all the countries to meet these achievements. 26 billion only for Germany, 16 billion for Italy. But my question is about, shouldn't we, alongside this quantitative goal, focus more on qualitative goals? Not in terms of outputs, which are classified, but I mean in capability of acting together. What is the point of spending more if we are launching right now, 6 different programs of frigates in the European countries? What is the point of saying that the UK is the first country in Europe spending if UK does not want to act and to go to Syria? So instead of focusing on the muscles, which are important, yes, money does matter. Shouldn't we focus more on our political capability? Sorry to be long.
No, that was very focused. Next question, please. No stranger.
Thank you. Great discussion. I think it's very stimulating that we managed to talk about a figure, a budget figure, and have some real political strategic points.
Fabrice, maybe some of these people don't know you.
Sorry, Fabrice Potier from NATO. I just wanted to make 2 very quick comments and 1 question. Very quick comment, I totally agree with Ambassador Lute. I think there's no dilemma between input and output, because I think the real equation is you've got to get both right. Because we know some countries are good on input, but are not really there on output, and vice versa. So I think it's a non-debate. I like very much Malcolm's points, but I slightly disagree that somehow the geometry of European military powers have not really changed. Yes, you still have the top 2, France and the UK, there, but I think for 2 reasons it's changing. One is worrying, and one is a new trend. The worrying is you see what we can call the middle class. So Italy, Spain, Netherlands are really, if you look at the 10, 20-year trend, they're really what we say in French, décroché. That means they're really falling below the line of being both good on output and good on input. And this is a problem when you're an alliance of 28 allies, because you don't only need leaders, you also need other countries to make a real collective effort possible. So I think here there's an issue that goes beyond the usual European leaders, that is about, how do we make sure that we've got a whole of a European effort? The trend on the changing European geometry in military power, Malcolm, you only looked at European military power through the prism of expeditionary operations. But what we know since last year is there's a new front line open, which is what we call the Eastern Front, and which is very much about collective defense. And when it comes to collective defense, you do have new powers that matter very much. One is Germany, politically, but also militarily. One that is growing is also Poland. So I think the geometry here is kind of expanding in a way, as typically you are right that it was more expeditionary and crisis management. So I think we need to look at it as something more mobile and changing. My question. I was also in the backstage of preparing the transatlantic declaration, where we put the 2%, and it was a very interesting development. The one thing where we were always stuck, but for obvious reason, is how do we enforce these magical numbers? This is an alliance of sovereign nations with sovereign budgets and with difficult finance ministers, and we don't have per se enforcement mechanism, as now I think the EU has developed some kind of enforcement mechanisms on European countries' budgets. So a question to Ambassador Lute and maybe the two other speakers is, where could we go in the next years in terms of exerting slightly more pressure than diplomatic pressure? It can be naming and shaming, but how far can we go? I think we are doing better inside the privacy of the rooms in showing the numbers and who is doing well and who's doing less well. But should we go further? Should we have some more regular reporting? And should we have more public reporting? Because if not, the risk is that I get the point that communicating too openly about our strengths and vulnerabilities is a problem, but not communicating about them, I think, leads to speculation.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's a very good point. Well, as you know, NATO, we've always had discussions about NATO's communication skills. Yes, you were next.
Yes, Brooks Singer, Jane's Defense, straight to the question. Wales, the Wales 2% pledge was binding on temporarily politically elected governments and not their standing bureaucracies. So what is NATO going to do to organize, to keep up that pledge? Are you going to organize a pledge every 2 or 3 years and have new leaders sign on to that? And given that the allies are going to stretch out the achievement of that 2% as far as they can, we can safely assume it will be 10 years. What implications does that have for the RAP and the timing of the achievement of the RAP?
That was very sly how you snuck in your second question. Honestly, I have to keep my ears open. Yes, please.
Julian Barnes, Wall Street Journal. And on the issue of sovereignty versus pooled resources, is there a way to tweak how the VJTF, the spearhead force, is put together, fielded, utilized to force more of a pooled resource issue there? Is there a beginning of a solution in that?
Great questions. I think we should start from the last one, the pooled resources.
So let me take a stab at it. So first of all, there are some modest success stories in terms of pooling. They're admittedly, I say modest, but we are pooling for the Alliance Ground Surveillance, this UAV that I mentioned, 15 nations. We own and operate our own pooled AWACS fleet. So in the air, of the air, the surveillance of the air. There's some modest efforts with regard to pooling airlift. But fundamentally, the logic of the efficiency of pooling bumps up against sovereignty and defense industry issues. And so we've never gotten to the point where we've taken this hard decision to sacrifice some sovereignty for military efficiency. As regards, and this then intersects this question of could we use the VJTF perhaps as a vehicle to push more of this? I don't think so, and the reason for that is that the VJTF, the Spearhead Force, is organized around what we call framework nations, so lead nations on a 3-year rotational basis. So fundamentally, we're relying on national forces to man and equip the VJTF and not pooled forces. So it'd be quite difficult, I think, to find common capabilities that you could use nonstop across the VJTF spectrum. So we've gone to, and partly because it had to be ready. You know, we had to do it at Wales, and we're now executing. So we didn't have time to sort of craft a pooling solution. We had to go with what was on the shelf, and what was on the shelf were national forces.
But it's touching on Mr. Morrow's question also about the capabilities working together as well. And it has been such a mantra of NATO for such a long time. But
So of course, we call this interoperability, right?
Yes.
I mean, at least the operational integration of forces is interoperability. But I took your question more to do with industry and procurement and so forth.
The very decision to come together.
So, but policies towards acquisition or policies towards operational policy making? We're quite integrated. I mean, that's what I do, you know, something like 12 hours a day. I mean, so, you know, from the outset, the members have committed to an integrated military command structure. So this is Phil Breedlove, just down the road in Mons and so forth, but also a standing political structure, which is the North Atlantic Council. So that, you know, I could get, I hope I don't, but I could get a call before the end of the session. The council is convening to take up a political issue. All of us live here in Brussels. If we're away, we're required to have a deputy. We're on recall. So it's quite integrated. I mean, integrated to the extent that I spend more time with these folks than I do my family. So,
Jan, you want to come in here?
Yeah, I have a few comments. I think this has been covered in a way. Of course, there are two levels, interoperability and integration. Integration is the much more far-reaching kind of thing, which I think is what you're alluding to, and PESCO is an instrument in the EU to foster that integration. That's not going to come anytime soon. There are some rumors that the Germans all of a sudden want to make this part of the British negotiation. I'm not sure that's actually going to fly. But you know, so what? That's yes.
Right
no, that's for afterwards when we have alcohol.
That's why they're making it.
On Fabrice, two things that Fabrice said. First of all, the dilemma on input and output, and I agree with what Ambassador Lute said. That of course, you know, there is a correlation between spending and outcomes. I mean, that's quite clear, and that's almost like a commonplace. If you don't spend anything, there's also no outcome. But it's interesting how greatly that varies inside NATO. I mean, you have countries that have a relatively healthy ratio, and then you have countries that have a totally unhealthy ratio. Our host country, Belgium, is one of those that has an unbelievably unhealthy ratio, you know, where the level of spending that goes into non-outputs is just, you know, not sustainable at all. But they have sustained it for a long, long time. Not going to change it anytime soon. So yes, there is this correlation. Does that buy us a lot more? No. It means that 2% is not meaningless, but it also means that 2% is still not, you know, certainly not enough in terms of the argument that you want to make. Secondly, on how to enforce 2%, you know, that's a tricky question. In the end, you of course can't enforce because it's a non-binding commitment, and that means that, you know, you can only do soft stuff to enforce it. But perhaps you can, and that's a communications issue more than anything else. You know, use parts of these 9 criteria to the extent that you can use it. I mean, most of it is classified, but you can perhaps find some poetry that uses it without breaching the confidentiality. Shameless naming and shaming, that's a problem for NATO itself, obviously, because the member states run NATO, and they don't want to be named and shamed by you guys. But there are ways to play it, perhaps. You know, I think naming and shaming is probably the best thing to do.
On that front, yeah, and so just at the defense ministers meeting just last June, for the first time, you probably helped behind the scenes on this, right? We actually displayed, so 28 defense ministers, Secretary General, the session is alive, and we passed out a chart that had across the top 11 measures and across the flank 28 countries. And there was, you know, it was red and green. It was quite stark. Getting NATO to be that only that transparent was a multi-month effort, okay, just to produce the chart and get it in front.
And I think we removed one of the 2 colors.
Yes,
Yeah.
and no, So,
Green and red.
so we're in the early days of internal accountability and transparency, but also underappreciated in the pledge. The leaders agreed to do that, to check this and show and tell at every future summit.
Excuse
So-
me, Ambassador,
so that's
excuse me. But that's all internal, and it's taken you 60 years to reach this. I mean,
Oh, it took us-
a year ago we were sitting here discussing why NATO matters, and we were not campaigning, but fighting, not fighting, that's the wrong word, but struggling to reach out to the public. And we're getting into the whole problem of this 2% that you barely name and shame among yourselves. What about reaching out to the public to say, this is what's the issue of NATO? This is about, as Jan put, this is about the security of the transatlantic alliance. This is about protecting our security. The public knows nothing about it. And one more, Malcolm, did you want to comment?
We have to respond to this, though. Jim.
Obviously. I think that's more you, actually. On Fabrice, and the Wall Street Journal is in the room. Documents can be leaked. I'm just saying that.
That would never happen.
No, that would
never happen in our government.
When you have it in your case. Yes. Yeah, and then Malcolm. Jan, you wanted to come in here?
No, that's fine.
Malcolm.
Let me just come back on some points. I mean, in the UK debate, the 2% mattered. I mean, it mattered. I think it did give those arguing for an increment to the defence budget some extra power to their elbow. But I think the reason it mattered in the UK is because we were so close to the 2%. So it was a realistic thing to do in terms of our national budget. I think the further countries are below it, the more important it is to have other indicators which they can realistically, in terms of their own domestic politics, without increasing their budget by 40% or something. And that's where some of these confidential indicators come in. But it's also other things in terms of contributing to various missions and so on. So I think, and there are some countries which are at 1.3, 1.4%, who are punching above their weight in Iraq, and did so in relation to Libya, and others who did not. So, I mean, those are important indicators. We shouldn't only be focusing on spending. Some of the questions about pooling, I mean, I think sometimes those questions are more relevant for those countries which don't have any possibility of having an independent capability without pooling. So it tends to be the smaller you are, the more important that is. But one of the reasons why the UK and I think France, maybe Germany, spend a bit more in defence is because political leaders know that they have an instrument which they can use, and they don't have to get the veto. They don't have to go to NATO to do it. They don't have to get 20 other countries to agree to it. It's something they can actually use independently. Now, of course, and I realise that's difficult, but we do live in a lines of independent democratic countries with separate defence budgets accountable to our national taxpayers, and therefore you have to get a big benefit from pooling and sharing. And on procurement, I think the UK experience historically of collective procurement projects, collaborative procurement projects in Europe is pretty mixed in terms of cost saving, because of all the different military requirements and all the different defence industrial interests come in, and actually you'd have been cheaper. It would be cheaper and produce better weapon systems if you bought something off the shelf or had something much more straightforward. And that's why we've ended up going for F-35 rather than another European combat aircraft to the next combat aircraft generation. Fabrice's points are really excellent in terms of the geometry, and I'll go and think about them. I think one of the questions I have is that in this period when the main focus has been in expeditionary warfare after the end of the Cold War, I would say that the German position in that pecking order has fallen, and maybe also some of the other European countries you're talking about, because Russia and collective defense has become less important. Now it's become more important. It's not the only game in town, but it's become more important. It'll be very interesting to see whether the role of Germany and maybe the Netherlands, maybe some others, moves up that pecking order a bit more compared with what it has been for the last 20 years. And my impression, but others probably know more, my impression is that defense is being taken more seriously in Germany than it has been for some time, precisely because deterrence of Russia is something which the Germans feel more comfortable with than they did with involvement in traditional British British areas like Iraq and Afghanistan, where after all were part of our imperial sphere of influence in the past. So maybe not. Maybe that won't be the change. But of course, one of the results of this all coming down is that the countries near the bottom of that league table, even if the relativities haven't changed so much in aggregate terms, do end up in more and more areas being unable to generate a credible national capability. And of course, because their national forces are very reluctant to specialize, because specialization is always something you want other people to do, but it's very difficult for any of us to reduce the spectrum of our capabilities, because it means relying more on others who may not be there on the day.
One thing that's interesting that underpins both the report but the conversation this evening is this question of shared threat perception. And just a data point, if you look at the defense spending decisions since over the last year, the closer you live to Russia, the more clear-cut you have, in most cases, legislated your path to 2%. So it's so for the eastern flank allies, it's more than a Wales pledge among leaders who can arguably change office and so forth. For them, if you take the Balts, for example, they're on a legislative path to get to 2%. Poland's already there. Estonia's already there. Romania is making big strides. So it's interesting. Geography here still counts, right? And they have a shared threat perception, and one that is quite up close and personal, because it wasn't that long ago that they lived this threat.
Absolutely. Whereas Britain would see more ISIS as a threat in a very different way, and the French would have their own.
In the South, migration and ISIS and so forth.
The announcement of more money for defence in the UK, Cameron made a speech saying what he really wanted more capability for was drones, I-STAR and counter-terrorism.
We have room just for a very short round of questions, and I hope we can deal with them very quickly. There was a question here and a question there. Please, can you're first, yes? Please identify yourself.
Yes, thank you. David Fouquet. I'm with the European Institute for Asian Studies at the moment, so I might have some views on the rebalancing to Asia. But more relevant, I covered NATO as a journalist since the 60s, when I kept hearing pledge year after year about flexible response that we never met. We never adopted the capabilities. I'm wondering now whether, again, there's a need for a flexible response and a look at priorities. Asymmetric or hybrid warfare was mentioned. I wonder whether that requires the same kind of big-ticket capabilities that we have had in the past, such as BMD, ballistic missile defense, which, if I remember correctly, was targeted against Iran, Iranian capability. Is that still a factor?
Okay, that's very important, especially in the light of the Iran. Thank you. Please.
Just on 2%,
And your name?
Cyrus Wolski, former Europe Minister of Poland,
Yes.
former Chairman of Foreign Affairs Committee and NATO delegation of the European Parliament, author of the defense policy position paper of the biggest fraction of the European Parliament. Congratulations on focusing on 2%. That's to Mr. Techau. The endless discussion we can have on security, but this is very precious, and I have to say that I distributed your paper at the bureau meeting of our fraction on defense position paper. So with some hesitation, because I didn't like the parts of your paper where you put into doubt the sense of using it. As a politician, I'll tell you, yes, it's a great sense. Second, as a politician, I'll tell you, don't trust politicians, rather trust systemic solutions. We as Europe, we are free riding on US, and you, Western and Northern and Southern Europe, you are free riding on us, Central Eastern Europe. In terms of expenditure, it's contrary to the solidarity principle. I have a question to a German, whether the new explosion of solidarity in Germany will lead us somewhere closer to that. My question is as follows: whether neutralizing defense expenditure under excessive deficit procedures of the European Union, not only EMU, but under deficit procedure of the EU, in a sense as it was done with the Juncker investment plan, which means they are counted into deficit but not punished by the Commission. a proposal which I have put into the paper and which I've lost the vote by 16 to 11, which is not that bad. My question is whether this systemic solution, when there's some hope of more common perception of the threats coming, would not be a solution which would not necessitate to have every 3 years new generation of leaders to meet, but to create a systemic solution that every expenditure up to 2% commitment would be excluded from punishment by the rules of the union fiscal rules, and then we would have probably the input as it should be, and good input guarantees good output. Thank you.
Well, it sounds like breaking the Stability Pact, being sanctioned or fines. Who would like to pick up this, Mr. Saraswalski's point? Or maybe
I don't have one on the EU internal dynamics, but I do want to come back on missile defense.
Sure.
So you're right, the ballistic missile defense that's in operation today and maturing over the next couple of years, NATO owned and operated, is focused on Iran. And it's important to remember that the deal which has been signed dealt with the nuclear warheads atop ballistic missiles, but only those warheads. So not conventional warheads, not chemical warheads, and not the missiles themselves. So while arguably, if implemented according to the standards, the nuclear threat will be reduced, the purpose of the agreement itself, it doesn't reduce the threat of Iranian missiles. And so NATO is proceeding on program with its BMD.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
You're absolutely right to focus on response to asymmetric threats, because I think that's very important in the Middle East, but it's also, I think, important in relation to Russia. And missile defense, I think, is part of that, where we're facing greater missile threats, including in the Middle East and elsewhere. So that's something that's important. I think also important is investment in intelligence and surveillance, really critically important in terms of what we're doing in different parts of the world. And actually some independent national capability in that regard is important for some European countries also, in order to have political influence. Special forces really important, play a really important role. And also I think development of cyber capabilities, including offensive cyber capabilities, is really important in terms of some of the forms of threats we're facing going forward, because of course we have to have deterrence of a force-on-force scenario with Russia, but precisely because NATO has very considerable conventional capabilities, Russia's more likely to do things which try and get under the threshold where we're likely to get involved in large-scale conventional warfare. And we need to deterrence is most effective if you can match an opponent at each level, and therefore escalation is credible.
But these asymmetric tools below conventional are the most difficult, because they're designed to be ambiguous, sometimes non-attributable, and they're designed also to play against the boundaries of where military force and police forces and border guards and so forth, where all those boundaries lay inside our governments. So this is a real challenge for NATO, because we have part of that responsibility, but part of the responsibility falls on the nation itself, the first line of defense, and a big part of the responsibility falls on the EU as well. So you have a triangle between national, NATO, and EU responsibilities, and we're only just defining how that should work. It's a big challenge.
That's really important. Jan, you wanted to come in here and maybe
two final things.
Yes.
I think it's absolutely right what Mr. Fouquet said, that pledges historically don't make much, of a difference. And therefore, I try to be very cautious with the 2% overall. It makes a lot of sense when it comes in combination with the real threat perception. We have that partially in NATO, which is why it partially works, but we don't have it across NATO, which is why it doesn't work across the board in NATO. I think it's in a simplified way, I think that's the truth of the matter. And we can have 100 more pledges, if there's not a real credible threat, then that's not going to lead us very far. On Germany, Malcolm earlier said that, it's interesting how now that, territorial defense Article 5 stuff is kind of en vogue again, the Germans all of a sudden are more there. And I think that's absolutely crucial to understand if you want to understand German defense. policies and its position in NATO, the Germans find expeditionary warfare, very, very unpalatable for a number of reasons. And they always, teeth-grindingly do it, but they don't really want to do it, and it's always a hard sell domestically. That's not the case when it comes to Article 5. And you could see this after Ukraine, when the Germans were actually surprisingly forthcoming in the reassurance immediately after that turned hot. A lot of people in this town were very surprised about the Germans actually coming forward relatively solidly and quickly, and meaningfully also, not only framework nation, but also in terms of meaningful contributions. And so I think in that sense, will this new outburst of solidarity in Germany, will that lead us anywhere? On Article 5, I think, and I'm saying this, having been a staunch critic of the Germans for many years, which has made me a lot of friends in Berlin. But I think on that Article 5 commitment, Germany is rock solid. I wouldn't doubt that for 1 second. Whether it's always capable to deliver what is desirable is another question. But it's in terms of its determination to live up to its Article 5 commitment, I think nobody should really doubt, the steadfastness of Germany. And that's pretty much a political consensus in Europe, in Germany, apart from some loonies on the fringes. But on expeditionary warfare, that remains the big story to be seen. That, for me, is the litmus test as to whether Germany can become more than just a player in very confined, integrated European contexts, or whether Germany can also step up to become a guarantor of a more kind of global stability framework that essentially is what's at stake, and whether Germans kind of feel very difficult, and for me that remains the big question in Germany. But in terms of will Germany defend Poland if that needs to, absolutely it will.
Yeah, thank you. This is we're going to wrap up this session. Before we do, I just want to say a big thanks to Jan for all the work at the paper, and a big thanks for Ambassador Lute for coming here and giving a very special view and reassuring us, which is very important. And no,
I hope you got that, but I'm not sure how you did.
And Malcolm, no, it's very complicated, this security vacuum at the moment, the whole idea of it. And Malcolm, thank you for going through the whole mechanics of Britain. One thing before you go, this is only part of a series. This is not going to stop this evening. It started several months ago with the question of the week, and then we invited Malcolm to write, and several other people across Europe and from the United States to contribute to this whole issue of 2%. And the debate will go on and change, and it just doesn't stop here. So I just want to reassure you, actually, that there will be more discussions of this nature. And thank you very, very much for coming, and we invite you to the hamburgers and wine and the hot dogs.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
A pleasure. It was very interesting.